Great stories have heroes. They have villains. They have conflict. They have happy endings, sad endings, and sometimes no ending at all. Bruce Springsteen, the boss, has for decades painted pictures of the American experience through his music. Each of his songs tells a story of his life, and these stories have the power to transform us into a song, as if we're almost living it. And great storytelling brings together people through shared experience, making one individual, one person, feel a part of something bigger. Our goal here today is to help you think differently about stories you tell and encourage you to invest the time and learn from great storytellers so your brand will stand out, take off, and stay on course. I'm Winnie Brignac-Hart, and I'm here with Lori Brignac-Lee. We launched TwinEngine 25 years ago, actually this month, as a traditional agency. And we've had just, thanks to so many people, incredible success. And we're now focused on making and helping companies adjust to the changing landscape of marketing. And together we bring right brain, left brain approach to helping companies and brands stand out, take off, and stay on course. So let's take a look at what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how to tell your brand story, to talk about building a brand story that's awesome, memorable, and engaging. We're going to talk about strategies on how to stand out, get noticed, and remembered, and speaking in a language that appeals to your ideal leads. We're going to talk about the how-tos of storytelling. What are the components of a really awesome and great story? And strategies to get everyone giving the same elevator pitch, not the ditch, about your brand. And then really understanding how to stand out from the competition with your True North advantage. Today's webinar is a part of an 8-part series that focuses on discovering your True North advantage so that your brand can stand out, take off, and stay on course. As a housekeeping, you can find How to Tell Your Brand Story webinar recording on our website at TwinEngine.com. And thanks everyone for your feedback and questions prior to the webinar today. I hope that we're able to bring your questions into today's webinar to benefit everybody. And you can always reach me at winnie@twinengine.com anytime. Everyone good with that? Okay, let's get started. One thing's certain, you can't expect to stand out from the crowd telling the same story everyone else does. If you want to transform your organization, you first need to transform your story. A good story is authentic, it's creative, it makes and is emotional and has some element of personal connection, and it inspires action and takes the audience on a journey with the brand. And good stories impact the way we feel, the way we think, and the way we act, and how we behave. And your brand, whether you know it or not, is made up of stories. And they're your stories, your employee stories, and the stories others tell about you. You know, Lori and I always talk about the fact that we've learned some not so good habits in building content. Because we're really overloading people with data and corporate speak. So here's the thing to remember is really no one remembers. We don't connect. And if we can't connect, we can't inspire and speak from a place of shared experiences like Bruce. So as Bruce is to storytelling for entertainment, Steve Jobs is to storytelling in terms of corporate stories for the same reason. It's all about entertainment and influence. As you know, Steve was famous for his keynotes, launching new products or making announcements, and he would agonize for hours over the details of his presentations. He just had this amazing knack to craft a narrative and just this suspense and delivering just a really solid messaging. And the interesting thing to me about Steve is it wasn't really about special effects or crazy props. It was about storytelling. And Steve was the master of really simple, bold ideas that all strung together to help us connect with technology and be inspired by the potential of how it will and has impacted our lives. And I know you've seen the Stanford Speech, but I just wanted to read one small part of it that has just always inspired me. This is one of those things to really keep sort of in your storytelling idea box. I mean, this just is such an amazing speech. And he says, "I am honored to be with you today at your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. I never graduated from college. Truth be told, this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation. And today I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories. And the first story is about connecting the dots. So if you remember the stories, the 3 stories, I'll just remind you, the first one was about connecting the dots. And he talked about how you can't connect the dots looking forward, and he shared a personal story about that. And then he talked about, his second story was really about finding what you love early in life. And the third was about living each day as if it was your last. And I still remember those 3 things from the speech because he made it really simple. I'm here today to tell you 3 stories, and they all had personal stories behind each of them. And I know that you remember this commercial, or at least I hope you do, because it's one of the things that transformed my life in being in branding and advertising and marketing, and that is this the Super Bowl ad that ran December 31st, 1993? Yeah, because it's 1994. No, it's 1983. Let me get this right. 1983. And the reason I remember it is because it changed the way I saw storytelling. And it was the first time I was introduced to Apple. And the message was on January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. And the interesting thing about it, it only aired once, and it was, I think it was during the Super Bowl, and just really, really transformed the way we tell stories about brands. You never actually saw a computer in the ad, and everyone was on the edge of their chair waiting for January 24th, and Steve Jobs fulfilled that promise, and here we are today. So again, one more thing about Steve Jobs, and that is just about consistency in storytelling styles. So it's not just about the words that come out of your mouth and the story that's on paper, it's how you look and how you project when you're telling that story. And we're talking about, telling your story, right? So you're a leader in an organization, and your story should align with the story of the organization. Because if they don't, there'll be a disconnect. And it has to be really genuine. It has to be you. And everyone has a different style and a different story. And you should really, really, really embrace your own style. And one thing to remember is consistency is a word. Consistency of all kinds is what builds brands. For example, people who wear the same thing are more memorable than those who don't. It says, this is who I am. We see Steve in his jeans and his turtleneck, And I think it's a positive thing that helps people identify with people. And it allows people to be themselves. And so consistency, Steve Jobs was all about consistency in the way he spoke, in the way he told stories. And he spent the time to get it right, and he spent the time to keep it consistent. I'm just still amazed at how he looked the same after so many years. What an amazing man, an amazing mentor for me. Because, this has happened to me 1,000 times. I'm sure it's happened to you, and I'm sure it's why you're here today. So do you ever find yourself being asked, and it's usually a really simple thing, right? What does your company do? And you're like, you have no idea what to say, right? You've got like 5 minutes to like share your story and to clearly communicate what you do, and you blow it. And we all know how that feels. We all know how that feels. And the person standing across you is just like, they're confused, disengaged. And you're like in this place where you're either saying nothing or you're talking in circles, and maybe you never even get to the point, and it's like epic fail. In today's world, everything you say tells the story of your brand. And there's this constant fear among all of us of never really knowing what to say or saying the wrong things. And the challenge is you lose that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and you never get it back, right? You never get it back. It's like, oh God, I wish I would have, why did I do that? Why did I freeze? Because you never really know when that opportunity to tell your story is really going to happen. So I encourage everybody, please be prepared. And I hope if that's the one thing that we help you do today, Lori and myself, is really help you be prepared for that opportunity. Because marketing is no longer about the stuff you make, but it's about the stories you tell, right? This is Seth Godin, another amazing mentor and just an incredible person who's really learned to tell his own story. Because, you may not know, what the grade you had when you were in high school or the name of your teacher, but you remember the stories of your time in high school. And those stories are what really bring people together. And it brings people together with others and builds lifelong connections, how we build connections. And if you think about it for a minute, when you think about marketing strategy and what would happen if you just told stories as a brand and thought about your brand as the stories that string together to create that life of a company or an organization. And then how your personal stories impact your organization's brand story, like my stories, like Winnie's stories or Lori's stories. How do our stories come to TwinEngine and impact the whole story of the company? And I want to talk a little bit about, because if you can tell a story, you can be a great public speaker, right? And they did this big poll about what people fear most in life, and public speaking was in the top 10. But if you can tell a story, you can be a great public speaker. And Lori and I have had a lot of, training centered around speaking. And one of the first things that I learned was really to develop an archive of personal stories, right? And so it's really simple. You just get a sheet of paper and start thinking about what those are. And I have a folder it's in my office that, Winnie stories. And if you look at our website and you look at TwinEngine, for example, and it's really all about a story of our dad. And it really came from many, many years ago with my dad. I'll tell you real quickly for those of you who don't know it, because I love the story. So, we love our dad. Lori and I are like, oh my gosh, so he calls each of us his favorite because, of course we each, I know I'm his favorite, but Lori thinks that she might be his favorite. But he had this whole thing when we were kids, and we would go to this place where he and my brother would fly these small little airplanes. And Lori and I were bored to tears, but we would just observe this every Saturday, and he would just fly planes and crash planes and fly planes and crash planes. And I remember one day he said, I want to fly a big plane. I want to learn how to fly. And he did. And he worked for a refinery, and I remember the gigantic books on the kitchen table, and every night when Dad would get home really, really late, he'd be reading these books, and they were all over the place. But I'll never forget the day that I was in the front yard of my house, and my dad flew over, right, his first flight. And he was just, I'll never forget that day. And the one thing he taught Lori and myself was that you have to fly small planes before you fly big planes, right? And the whole idea that, it's just all about, you've got to put in the effort, you've got to put in the time to do big things with the small things, right? So obviously that's one of the stories in my folder. Tons of stories from, simple things about a friend of mine who I was on a trip, and this is just one that I'm remembering. And he told me to stop and look. We were hiking, and stop and look is what he said. And I'll never forget it because I was like looking at my feet, of course, trying not to probably fall over myself, but stop and look. And stop and look has had a big impact on me in terms of working with people. It's like you get so bombarded about looking at what's happening, and you don't really stop and look at what's really happening. And so that's another big story that I can bring into helping people see things in a different way, right? And flying small planes and big planes is a way that I can help people think smart and starting small, right? So for example, if I said, let's learn how to fly some small planes before we fly big planes, it will be all about, let's spend some time just jotting down just little quick sentences about what all of your individual stories. And I bet in an hour you could come up with like 6 pages of these. So, and then this is what really becomes your competitive advantage, not only as a person, as a leader, but as a leader in your organization, right? Your stories are your stories, and they're unique, and they will help you stand out. And Lori and I know a little bit about standing out because, of course, we're identical twins, and we're being constantly compared to each other. We've spent our lives looking for ways to stand out, even though we look the same, and tried lots of things, different hair, different clothes, different careers, and even different friends. But when we really look back, it was all about the acceptance that we all look the same, right? And knowing that we need to look deeper into what really makes us different. And that's how we ultimately stand out, right? The way something looks is just one of the factors when we talk about standing out, just one, right? When we think about our brands, that they're unique, and they should be obvious to others why someone else is better, or we're smarter, we're more powerful, but it's not obvious to people. So the first step is understanding that to most people, most brands look the same, right? So even though we look the same, we have unique stories that make us unique. And, you have to think about when you think about what your unique stories are, people can't recreate those. They can't copy those, right? And it really, really, really puts you in a place to really stand out in a really unique way. We're going to talk a lot about how to implement that into your strategy. And, and you can guess again, you've seen some of these before that, again, I have no idea which one I am in the picture. So it's kind of interesting. We hear this all the time. It's one of the most frequent things that we hear. We're absolutely the best at this. Why don't people understand it? And then if you could just stop for a second, and this is what we encourage people to do, is just, okay, so what is not connecting here? If this is true and this is real, then why? Something's not connecting. It's just because we're saying it in a way that isn't connecting with another person, right? So Lori and I have 3 daughters between us, Miranda, Morgan, and Olivia. So guess what? We have a focus group. Our 3 daughters, Miranda, Morgan, and Olivia, that's our focus group. And we used to spend a lot of time, a lot of effort in focus groups, but, I would like you to think about rethinking your approach when it comes to focus groups and getting feedback. And when you're really testing a story, post it on Facebook, post it on social media channel and see how much engagement you get, see what kind of response you get. And because, people always talk to us about vertical focus, and it was, are you B2B? Are you B2C, right? But now it's P2P, it's people to people, or it's B2P, business to person. And so we're really connecting with people. And so we have to communicate like people connect to people and not businesses communicating to businesses. So, if Miranda and Morgan and Olivia or your social connections don't get it, no one will, okay? And the lesson in that one is don't be boring. So, all right, here we go. There's an art to storytelling, and there are methods. So I'm going to share three methods with you. Okay, and again, a recording of this webinar is going to be available to you online, and you can send me an email anytime, winnie@twinengine.com, and I can send you a link so that you can capture all these notes. So it starts with who. This is a really simple story formula. I'm going to give you some elevator pitch ones in a second too. Who's involved, right? This is really simple stuff, but it's a formula. Were you by yourself? Were you with another person, a group of people? And how are all those people related? What happened? What's the action? What was going on? Where was it? Right? And then here's a real opportunity with where. Where's a wonderful thing. So when you talk about where, talk about senses, right? So if I was going to talk to you about that place where Lori and I were sitting with our dad, watching him, fly these model airplanes, I would say, oh my goodness, it was so hot, right? And they didn't even have chairs to sit on. We would bring those little fold-out chairs and sit on those. And I'll never remember that we spent countless hours looking for 4-leaf clovers. Okay, are you getting kind of a sense of what that scene was like? So where is really where you're able to really build in that sort of descriptions of the scene. Even if you're talking about a presentation that you did and you're telling a story, you can talk about, and I'll never forget the guy that was sitting in the back of the room that kept clicking his pen, right? Or it was so cold in there. I had to take my napkin off of the table to cover myself up because I was, just to try to bring someone into the story to engage them. And then there's always a conflict, right, in a great story. And this is where the real bulk of the story is. And you have to think about what's the importance of it, what happened, and what was the action that you did to try to resolve what was happening. And then, of course, there's the resolution, right, and how you're able to handle that task and set it up as a conflict. But the most important piece is what we call the tag, okay? And the tag is, it's trickier, but it's kind of the aftermath of the resolution, and it could be a joke, it could be one big finish, it could be, and with Steve Jobs, it was the three things, right? It was the lessons you learn before you die, right? It was big ending statements that, because you're remembering the beginning and you're remembering the end, right? So just remember that. So, for example, the last story I told, you probably remember that Lori and I have 3 daughters between us, and maybe don't be boring, which was, I think, the end. I'm trying to remember what I talked about. But there's this thing about threes, right? Once upon a time, there were 3 bears. There's so many threes. So when you think about, when you're developing a story, think about, if you're looking for things to talk about in the story, think about a way to introduce it with 3 things. But anyway, I want you to really focus on the tag, which is the very end, very short sentence, the one thing I want you to remember from the story I just told you. Another one is really, you've got the hero, right, which is a little similar to the other one in terms of conflict resolution. There's a goal, there's a conflict, there's a mentor, and there's a moral, okay? So you got the hero, the person who's coming in to achieve a specific goal that was founded on a conflict. There's a mentor, someone who comes in and helps. This is really good in business. But, there's always the moral or the lesson learned. And this, again, is like the tag, but it's like, and the moral of the story is, you've heard, better safe than sorry, don't judge a book by its cover, slow and steady win the race. So go through the whole story and think about something that brings it together. And that may even be your tagline, right, when you're developing stories. And I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself. But, when telling your story, the tagline might be the final ending tag or moral. Another great story formula is called better, after, and bridge. So how this is set up is you've got, before is like kind of like, here's your world, right? After is like, well, imagine what it would be like if whatever a problem you had was being solved. And then the bridge is how you get there, right? Really simple, 3 steps. So let's see. So I'm just going to do an example of one that we're talking about right now. Okay, so do you ever find yourself being asked, what does your company do, and you have no idea what to say? Okay, that's your before. Right? Okay, you've got 45 seconds to share your story and clearly communicate what you do, but you blow it, right? You left them confused and disengaged, and you never get to the point. But in today's world, everything you say tells the story of your brand, right? And you want to be really, really prepared to know what to say, when to say it, and how to say it. You've got to be ready, because you don't know when that opportunity is going to happen. So let's look at some ways to be prepared. Okay, so I'm talking about before, the state, after, what it feels like when you're prepared, and I'm bridging it with taking you to the next place. So before and after and bridge. And again, this is all going to be there, and all the notes are there too. And when I think about stories, I always, one of my bylines here is, what would Don Draper do? He's a great pitch guy. So when we look about telling great stories, I think about the elevator pitch. And what I'd like to encourage each of you to do is to not use the one we've used in the past, right? And the one, I'm sitting here almost yawning, right? It's the need, the product name is a blank, that, what the one key benefit is, unlike blank, the competition, the product blank. Right, which makes the product makes it different than everyone else. And really think about a few different ways, and I'll just share a few different ways to kind of rethink your elevator speech. Okay, so one of my favorite elevator speech formulas is the one that was created by Know Your Why. And really simple. And one thing to think about with this formula is it's not about you, it's all about them. So it's all about the person you're talking to. And to know that person, you have to really think ahead of time about who those potential people might be. So there's a little pre-work to this one for sure. Because, the whole thing is, how blank, well, what we do is blank. And the only thing you want from it is for them to say, well, how do you do that? Okay? So when you think about the beginning, okay, how, you have to really create a huge list of what your ideal customer pains are, right? You have to think about what it is that keeps them up at night, right? The thing that drives them crazy, the thing that you solve, right? So you go, how blank, well, what we do is, and then how you solve that problem, to encourage them to say, how do you do that? And then you go into, we blank, and talking about what you do. So, how, well, what we do is, and then you want to get to how do we do that. And just keep it really simple, but the pains have to be there. I'll give you an example. Okay. How it's harder and harder and harder and harder to stand out today, right? It's hard. Well, what we do is we help brands tell awesome stories that stand out and get remembered, right? And then someone would say, well, how do you do that? And then you go into how you do that. So that's an example of this one. One of my favorite brands that is an incredible story, and this one really well. Honestly, I've never had a Dos Equis beer, but I know everything there is to know about the most interesting man in the world. I mean, do you even see a logo on this or a bottle of beer, right? So in his case, I can almost imagine, walking up and saying, well, what do you do? And most people would say something like, your typical beer guy would say, we make Dos Equis beer, bottle it, and distribute all over the world. I'm not connecting with it. Okay, whatever. You make beer and you bottle it and you send it places, right? But the way this guy might handle it, and if anyone has any ideas, you can absolutely send me some chat questions. Here's one. What do you do? And then he would say, well, would you like to meet the most interesting man in the world? And I would absolutely well, yes, right? And then you could go on and talk about how you bottle beer. Here's another one. What do you do? I don't always drink beer, but when I do, I prefer Dos Equis. That's a good one. What do you do? Do you want to meet the man who can ride a bull until the bull falls asleep? That's funny too. But I just love that everyone connects with this so much, and they've taken a real commodity market and created an incredible persona around it. And the great thing about this is they really, really know who their ideal lead is. So everything that's said is targeting that one ideal lead. It's not targeting everybody. It's only targeting that ideal lead. This is another one too that a really good friend of mine uses in the ad business, and it requires definitely some copy crafting, because of course she's really successful, and you should always borrow from the best. And it's called the rhyme formula, and it's if you want to the need, I can blank, you have to blank in the rhyme. So one of the ones that she always uses that I can remember is if you want to learn to soar, I can teach you how to roar, right? And honestly, this might sound a little corny to you. Okay, I'm going to read it back to you again one more time. If you want to learn to soar, I can teach you how to roar. The reason it works is because people remember rhymes, and I know that all the jingles from the 70s and 80s are probably still in your brains, and the reason they were jingles is because people remember rhymes. So it's something to think about, and this is something that your team could probably have really fun with. And the one elevator speech format that people absolutely love but are most terrified of is the one-word elevator speech. And seriously, the one-word elevator speech. There it is. There's a formula. One word. I can hear some of you shuddering a little bit. And what you do is you begin with a 50-word pitch, or however many words it is, and then you just keep cutting the words out until you get down to one, right? Or maybe you just go to the deep end and come up with one word from the beginning. This can be really powerful and a really fantastic exercise with your team, right? So if we had an elevator speech and we had to boil it down to one word, what would it be? And then you start from there and build out, okay? So some of the words that some of our clients have used in the past, and I have actually a list here, I'll read some to you, are mine actually ended up being a 2-word phrase in the exercise, and that was stand out. But here's some you might want to jot these down, so they'll be in the presentation. Profit, right? So imagine getting into the elevator. What do you do? Profit. I would be curious to understand what that meant. More sales. What do you do? More sales. What do you do? Different. When I think about different, I think about actually back to Apple. I think about think different. And it's a great one. More. Awesomeness. So what do you do? Awesomeness. And you'd be like, well, what does that mean? You might not say, well, what is that? You might say, well, what does that mean? Well, what do you do? Unforgettable, right? So that might be really interesting for someone who helps build personal brands. Smart and better are some of the other ones. What do you do? Smart, And the one interesting thing about that one is the first thing they started out with was the word technology, right? It was a True North Summit, and there were I don't know, dozens of words on the wall, and everyone really, really voted for the word technology. What do you do? Technology. And I was like, well, do I want to? I would run out of the elevator, or I'd be pressing the next floor down to try to get out of there if someone said that. But if someone said smart, I would think, well, what kind of smart do you do? And they would really lead me to what the real benefit of their technology was. And in this particular case, in this company, it was about the intelligence of the technology to really think through what the real need is from the human, and it did that. It's a really simple technology too. That was in the middle of that word. It's simple to do. So the one-word elevator speech. So when you've adopted one of those, it comes down to something really simple. Play and repeat. Play and repeat. Because the goal is, you don't want to be at a conference with your entire team and you're all sort of working the floor, and for everyone to be saying something different, for everyone to be saying a different thing. Now, we want everyone to be able to tell the story in their own way, but we want the story to be consistent. So if you start with one word and the word is smart, then tell sort of the formula on how that technology is smart, but then also maybe bring a personal story into it, right? Because one thing that's happening today is that we're bridging this gap between oral tradition, right? People telling people stories, and the digital age, right? So we used to tell people stories one-to-one, person-to-person, right? But now we're telling them digitally as well as one-on-one. And here's the challenge, and I really live by this, right? If you don't tell your story, someone else is going to tell it. You want to be you, right? And what you want to do is you want to be yourself so that someone else doesn't mold you into a story that has taken a life of its own that you can't change. And this really happens in the digital age, right? So you've got to, your story has to be by you, and you want it to be consistent with what everyone else is saying online. We have another webinar that it's about reputation, and maybe it's. I can send you the recording and the link if you wish. But it's about, in the digital age, really understanding and collecting all of those stories out there that are being said about you to even really understand what that perception is. So when you're building your own story, you're building your own pitch, that it's aligned with what the perception is out there in the market. There are a lot of ways and a lot of tools that you can use to do that. So if you have any questions, you can ping me on that one too. So TED, sharing ideas in communities around the world. The most popular talks they're 5 words or less. And so when you're looking at stories, you might want to look at TED, and you might want to look at the archives and the titles of those stories, because they're really, really great tags. And we talked a little about tags earlier. So, here's some of the ones that I know, that I remember, and ones where Simon Sinek, how great leaders inspire action. How great leaders inspire action. Why we do what we do, the surprising science of happiness, the best stats you've never seen, and then there's, I don't know if you've seen the one, how I held my breath for 17 minutes. And I always think to myself, what is the thing? What is it about all of the TED Talks that connect them all together, right? They're interesting. They're interesting. Right? They're interesting stories, they're memorable, and they're short, right? 18 minutes or less. So when you tell your story, when you document your stories, when you nail that elevator speech, I encourage you to ask yourself at the end, why should someone care, and why would I be interested in my own story? And really make sure that you are. Because it's got to be yours, right? And one thing that we see all the time is people come to us when they're developing a brand. They bring us all these other brands, and of course, everyone right now wants to be Uber, and they want to look at outside to really create their brand. And really, what it's all about is your brand. What is it about that makes you unique? Because copying someone else never really seems authentic, because it isn't, and it's hard to sustain, right? Because you're really just looking outside to create something. So you've got to really start inside and find your story. Because we really, it's our kind of our I don't know, we tend to emulate and copy others, and we look at other brands and what's working for them. And the question is, who are you, right? And the challenge is really not to follow and look like everyone else. And I certainly, know what that means. I get it. And it's because it's easy for me to see myself outside of myself. And I can see those subtle little differences, and I understand by observing how Lori and myself are perceived by others. So if what if you could understand your brand and even yourself at that level, right? And it's really back to stories. Steve was such a great storyteller. I keep thinking about him because, have you ever been in a situation, and I can hope that some of you are nodding at this point, where, someone is telling you something, but you're just not connecting with them, right? It's dry, it's boring, it's just data, we talked about data. And I'm sure what they're saying is important, but I am wandering. I'm thinking about, what's for lunch, or when's that presentation due, or, and I'm just not connecting with them. But then back to the story, and someone, they're not telling you something that's informational, they're telling you a story and something you can relate to, and you're interested and you're engaged. But the big thing is you remember it. You remember. 45 seconds. You got 45 seconds, right? Because of course, I know you'd love to thank the Academy. And one thing to think about with your team is this is a really, really fun exercise when you're helping people learn how to speak in public speaking. Is do mock I'd like to thank the Academy speeches, keep it to 45 seconds, and so that people are able to think of themselves as someone else when they're telling their story, right? And their story is essentially a movie written about them or a play that they've acted in, but they're thanking the Academy. So, really great. They're all on YouTube. There's some really amazing ones and some really terrible ones. So it's really, really, really a great place to look at about trying to keep it really succinct and keeping it to 45 seconds, or they will completely mic you out. And the same thing happens with people. Because one thing to remember is, people are bombarded with so much information every day. I've heard numbers between 3,000 and 20,000. And one of the biggest challenges is for us to realize that we're not only competing against our competition, that's what we always say. Who are your top 5 competing brands? We're competing with noise that we're all exposed to. So when someone's thinking about you and your products or your services, or even now multitasking, you're thinking about 500 other things, right? So the bottom line is there's tons of competition out there, and it's getting harder and harder and harder and harder for brands to stand out because everything looks the same, and there's a lot of it out there. You want to be top of mind, right? You want to be there when people are ready to buy, right? You've connected hopefully with someone through your story, and one thing to think about with your story too, because think of it like a journey to the top of the mind, right? It's a journey, right? It's a serious challenge, and that journey is simply it's from your heart to your head, okay? Your heart to your head, right? And maybe you have 2 levels of stories, right, that have heart stories and head stories. But you've got to connect with your customers and try to engage them to love you. And actually, our webinar next month is about how to get brands to love you. I'm really excited about that one because it's hard to break up with someone you love, and you really want to look at engagements, and whether it's relationships or customers or clients that, you really want them to love you. You want to deliver the best possible thing you can so that they can and will love you. So, it's all about nurturing, and you're caring and encouraging the growth of someone or something, but you're not selling, right? Not selling, no selling. You're telling stories, building relationships, so that when someone's ready to buy, that you're there, you're top of mind. You've connected the heart with the head, and you're top of mind. So one thing to think about, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about a funnel, but I know that you're all acutely aware of this. You're ultimately you're converting strangers to promoters, right? People that don't know you to people who love you and refer you. So when you're thinking about that story, think about how you adjust that story each engagement, right? Because you're going to speak to a stranger differently than you're going to speak to a customer. So once you nail that, elevator speech and those company brand stories, then think about which ones make the most sense at the different stage of engagement with the lifetime of a relationship. Because ultimately, we've got other tasks to do and tactics to implement, and one of those is SEO. I know we're all out there trying to be at least somewhat near the top in organic search, and so those stories do need to include keywords and long tail keywords that are relative to what someone's looking for online. So that's kind of next level strategy on taking your story to the next level. So when you start building content for your online presence, that you've got that unique and authentic story, but you also have the data, right? You've got those head things, right? The data to know what long tail keywords to bring into that story in an authentic way, right? So let's say Dos Equis beer, and someone's looking for, I wouldn't even know what to search because I've never had Dos Equis, but if I was looking for it, I might look for something like, great tasting beer. Okay, I'm much more of a wine person, but great tasting beer. So if that's something that we know that most, 50% of everyone is looking for, and they're looking for beer, then we would want to say, stay thirsty, my friend, and then somehow build in how it's also great tasting. So again, come up with your story, but then look at the data, use that data and that's out there and the knowledge from listening to what's being said online to bring that into your SEO and all of your other content, whether it's website content, back end page tags on your website, or social media post and sharing. We've talked about really thinking about what your competitive advantage is and how stories can be that. One thing to think about is what we call your true north advantage, and that is what your prospects are looking for and what you offer is not overlapping with what your competitors offer. Okay, so if I was looking back, let's just use Dos Equis for a second. If I was looking at good tasting beer and I was offering let's say prospects, and I was offering beer, right? That's like competitors would absolutely certainly be able to claim both of those things too. So that'd be kind of like where number 9 is. But the true north advantage of Dos Equis is the most interesting man in the world. Really, it's the advantage of Dos Equis, and you may actually know this beer and may be able to say there's something else. But from just what I understand and the research I've done on the product is that that is a huge advantage to them, and why it is such an advantage is because people who drink beer want to be the most interesting man in the world, or maybe the most interesting woman in the world. So anyway, again, aligning your story with what it is that really sets you apart, what your prospects are looking for, what you offer, what your competitors do not. Can't happen. Just like marketing can't fix a bad product or service, neither can a good story. Before, the emergence of social media, it was a lot easier, because it was easier to persuade a buyer. It was just, we were able to control the message, but that's not true today because, tools like Yelp can put you out of business in about 48 hours. And we've all become critics, right? We've all become authors and, inside and outside of our organizations. And the challenge is if you don't tell the truth, someone else will certainly tell it for you. So those stories have to be aligned with great products. I just want to throw this out there just about, what we do and how this fits in the other 8 webinars is right now we're talking about authentic messaging and telling your story. And it's aligned with a lot of other things, including, your purpose as a company. So we've already gone through a bunch of these webinars that you can see online. Your reputation, what is being said about you and your competition online, and really being aware of what that is. Brand alignment are the perceptions of who you are aligned with what people feel and care about you, and that's what the next webinar is about. Ideal leads, when we talk about the most interesting man in the world, they know who their ideal lead is, and that's why that campaign is so effective, because they only market to that person. They don't market to everybody, right? Do they stand out? Obviously they do, but does your brand stand out among its competitors? And then 2 things that aren't typically included, but in our True North Radar they are, and that is quarterly targets, like really building in ROI into, really establishing a quarterly target system, and most importantly, a disciplined mindset. So that, you come up with these great ideas, your stories, you've nailed that elevator speech, you know how you stand out, why you stand out, you create an amazing campaign, but you have to have the disciplined mindset to implement it consistently, especially when you might have, 2,000 marketers out there all trying to communicate the same thing, and you have to have really fixed standards to make sure everyone does it consistently. This is what a company we just did look like, just so you know some of the ratings, and it's from 0 in the center to 5 on the outside. So true purpose, they're nowhere near that, but they're pretty good on target. So you can see this is actually a financial institution. They're really good at establishing what they want to do, but they haven't really established the foundation. So if you might want to take, when you get this, print it out, look at it, and really think about with your team where you would be on these so that you know where to focus. So, all right, so we've talked about a lot of great things today. So here's what are the top 10 things to get started, right? And the first thing is really all about collecting brand stories, as many as you can. They include your stories, your competitors' stories, your senior leader stories, stories of your successes and your failures. And you really want to be the brand story ambassador, and maybe even identifying someone in the company that would actually even hold that title, brand story ambassador. Simplify your story and keep it authentic. It has to be real, has to be true, and has to be simple so people understand it. Practice till you're sick of practicing, but then the more you practice it, the more it will become natural, and you won't have to think about it when someone asks you what you do. And leverage that story for content and key messages. So once you get into the tactical side of this, how do you bring it into the key messages of the organization? How do you expand it to really talk about your product and services? And how do you build your editorial calendar that supports it? Be the story. So, companies come to us all the time, and that, they say we're dealing with these 3 brands, and, we're just kind of getting lost in all of this content. We really want to, improve where we are in terms of search, and that's so then just make the choice to be the story, right? And then what is it going to take to be the story, and do you have what it takes? And then, what can you leverage to really actually be the big story that's happening? Maybe you align it with something that's happening currently in the world where you have more opportunities to be picked up by main media, but tons of activities and ways to do that. And let me know if you have any questions on that one. Learn from other great storytellers. Go to TED. You can tell I've got some of my favorites, but there's some really great storytellers out there. Learn from their patterns. Learn from what's worked, and these are all very formulaic. These are formulas. If you look at every great presidential speech, it's a formula. If you look at 3 things, right? What people have the capacity to remember, and really think about those formulas, and think about which one is best for you, or how you might be able to adjust one that works for you. There's so much intelligence out there about your competitors, and they're all stories. People are telling stories about your competitors online. They're telling stories at the coffee shop. They're telling stories at professional meetings. Think about what they are, and as you're working on your stories, catalog what stories are being told about your competitors, because you're going to be compared by them, and a way to do it is absolutely through storytelling, but you have to know their story to do that. Bridge head stories with heart stories, right? We're trying to get to top of mind here, right? So we're bridging those heartfelt, warm stories that are sort of about the culture and the purpose of the company with head stories that are about how we achieved something, right? How we became the hero, right? And then we're using tags to bring those ideas into one simple statement. Understand your true north advantage. What is it about you that really is unique and different? And how can you bring that into your story? And then become the standard in your industry. Steve Jobs did it. And I mentioned Uber before. And one thing that's interesting about Uber and their whole marketing strategy is, and really their whole business strategy is, they couldn't be what they wanted to be, and they really looked at what it was in the market that they could achieve, and they stepped way out of it. So they essentially went way off the radar to establish something completely different and reinvent this whole category centered around the sharing economy. And they've become the standard in a completely new industry. And then be you, but really you. Be the real you. Try not to be someone else, because you have a great story to tell. Can't start a fire without a spark. back to Bruce, and the first step is it sounds really daunting when you're up there on the stage and you've got to say something, you've got to tell a story, or you get into the elevator and you're asked and you're intimidated and you don't know what to say. But grab a notebook and write down some simple story statements, right? They can be 1 or 2 words, lines, it could start off with something that happened yesterday or a major milestone in your company. Think about maybe categories: heart stories, head stories. And then, think about how people rationalize with their heads, but ultimately they connect with their hearts, right? Rationalize with their heads, ultimately they connect with their hearts. And the way they connect to their hearts is that they feel something, right? And we don't feel anything from data. We don't feel anything from corporate speak. What we do feel things from stories. So we expect big things from all of you because you're all unique, and your brand is the stories you tell and that you will tell, right? So go out there and share your stories, and please share your stories with us. We can't wait to hear them. So I have a couple of questions from everybody. Thanks so much for sending these in. Let's see. I'm the marketing manager for a large financial institution, very conservative one. How do I start engaging leadership to share stories? One of the best stories I know starts with "We the people." This is not new. It's just what an amazing story that is. And the Constitution, it just came to mind. But thinking about if there's a hesitation to sort of share stories, because everyone, of course, still wants to control the message, think about what stories are being told about that financial institution, maybe with a listening campaign. So just gather stories that are being told about you so that you can inform those leaders so that you know how you need to change the stories or impact the stories that are being told. And that's called a listening campaign, and I'm happy to send you some information about that. Number 2, we're a startup about to start building our brand. Where do we start? Tell the story of why you wanted to start the business in the first place. What about your life experiences led you to think of this company, or tell people the future stories you want to be told about you, like in 2020 we will something. That could be interesting. Is there a tool to collect stories? There are over 2,000 people here in different locations around the world. That makes me think about StoryCorps. And I don't know if any of you have even done StoryCorps or seen it, but you might want to check that out, StoryCorps. I think it's .org. But maybe just as simple as an online survey or a social media campaign, and I can share some examples with you if you just send me an email. Happy to talk through, give you some ideas on how to set that up. This is a funny one. Are you on the right in the photo? I guess they're talking about the one with the little white dresses. I think so, maybe. I really don't know. One little funny story to tell about that one is we were actually, I don't remember, I think it was 7th grade, and we actually gave out the wrong photos, the wrong school photos, because they were labeled the wrong names. And that was so funny. And what do you do after that happens? It's like, of course, everybody thinks they have my photo, but they have Lori's photo. Lori and I, we share the same stories. Of course we do, but the way we tell them is unique because we each have our own perspective. And that's another great thing about stories, and the stories that you're going to tell and the people in your company are going to tell is we all tell them differently. And, when you're working with your teams, just remember that, that if you can create a formula for it, we give them some option in that formula to add their own story to it. That could be really, really powerful. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for all the questions. Thank you for coming today to this webinar. Again, the recording's going to be available to you, and I really look forward to your feedback. And you can always reach me at winnie@twinengine.com, and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which is it's going to be about brand, and I'm going to talk about ways to get people to love your brand. So I'm really, really excited about that, and really excited about helping you take off and get above the clouds and stay on course. Thank you so much, everybody. See you next time.